Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from that contraption. Officer Reynolds squinted through the downpour at what used to be my carport and was now a pile of dismantled lumber. Your HOA president called. Again. I wiped the rain from my face. You mean Margaret? That woman would report a bird for singing off-key. Just keeping the peace, sir. He glanced at my '67 Mustang, now collecting rainwater in its formerly pristine interior. Nice car. Shame about the weather. Shame about the HOA, I corrected. Officer Reynolds nodded sympathetically. We'd been through this dance before. Look, Mr. Mitchell, Dave. Dave, I get it. But there's nothing I can do about your homeowners association. They make the rules for this neighborhood, not the police. So what exactly am I being accused of? Standing in my own driveway in the rain? He consulted his little notepad, now getting soaked. Suspicious activity and potential reassembly of prohibited structures. I laughed, despite the water dripping down my collar. Suspicious activity? I'm watching my car drown because Margaret Whitfield thinks a carport ruins the aesthetic continuity of Sycamore Ridge. Between us, Reynolds said, lowering his voice, she used the phrase neighborhood eyesore when she called it in. That was it. 6 months I'd lived here. 6 months of increasingly ridiculous HOA violations. And this was the final straw. My beautiful vintage Mustang, the one thing I'd kept after my divorce and the layoff from Boston Dynamics, was sitting there getting water damage because some pearl-clutching neighborhood dictator decided my simple carport wasn't up to the community standards. Well, you can tell Margaret that the eyesore has been removed, as demanded. I gestured to the pile of lumber. 48 hours, just like her notice required. I'll let her know you're in compliance. Reynolds tipped his hat, water cascading off the brim. For what it's worth, I think it's ridiculous, too. As he walked back to his patrol car, I stood there in the rain, watching my prized possession slowly fill with water, and something inside me snapped. I am an engineer, after all. We don't admit defeat, we find solutions. And if Margaret wanted to play by the rules, I'd give her exactly that. Malicious compliance of the highest order. Mr. Mitchell, the Sycamore Ridge Covenant clearly states, Margaret Whitfield's voice could cut glass. That I can't protect my property from the elements? I interrupted, waving the violation notice I'd received 3 days earlier. That all exterior modifications require prior approval. She adjusted her pearls. Section 8, paragraph 4. It's just a carport. My car is from 1967. It'll rust. Then perhaps you should have purchased a home with a garage, she smiled thinly, or read the covenant before signing. The covenant is 94 pages long? Yes, and every word matters. She glanced at her watch. That's 47 hours and 52 minutes remaining before fines begin accumulating. That had been yesterday, right before the storm hit. After dutifully dismantling my carport, I'd spent the night poring over those 94 pages of HOA regulations, looking for any loophole I could find. And at 3:47 a.m., fueled by spite and my 5th cup of coffee, I found it. No structures attached to the ground, huh? I muttered, scrolling through building codes. What if it doesn't touch the ground at all? I pulled up another tab and started researching magnetic levitation. By sunrise, I had the beginnings of a plan so beautifully overcomplicated that it made my engineering heart sing. Let me get this straight, Mike from Precision Contracting said, tugging at his beard. You want to build a platform for your car that appears to float? Not appears to. Actually floats. I spread out my sketches on his desk, using industrial-grade magnets and a counterbalance system. He stared at me, then at my plans. And this is because HOA won't let me build a carport. So naturally you've decided to defy gravity instead. He picked up my design. You know this'll cost at least triple what a carport would. Worth every penny to see Margaret's face. Mike sighed. I'd usually say no to crazy, but my daughter's college tuition is due. He tapped the plans. You're an engineer, you say? Mechanical. Worked for Boston Dynamics until the layoffs. Good, you'll need to be. Let's figure out how to make this monstrosity work. After 2 hours of revisions, we had something that might actually be possible. A platform that would appear to hover above my driveway through a combination of cantilevered supports, cleverly disguised tension cables, and yes, actual magnetic elements to stabilize certain components. We'll need specialized materials, Mike warned. And I'll have to bring in my cousin who does structural steel. This isn't exactly standard construction. Whatever it takes, I said, already calculating costs in my head. My severance package would take a hit, but some things were worth it. As I walked back to my car, my next-door neighbor, Eleanor, was outside watering her impressively non-regulation garden. Eleanor had to be pushing 70, but she had the sharp eyes and sharper tongue of someone half her age. Planning a revenge project? She called over. I blinked. How did you... I've lived next to 4 different homeowners, she said, adjusting her gardening hat. That's the exact expression of someone who's found a loophole in Margaret's precious covenant. I'm building a hovering car deck. Instead of laughing, she nodded appreciatively. Technically not attached to the ground, therefore not a structure under Section 8. Clever. You know the HOA rules that well? My dear boy, I've been fighting with Margaret for 7 years over these hydrangeas. She gestured to her vibrant blue flowers. They're technically above regulation height by 3 inches. We've measured together with rulers 16 times. I couldn't help but laugh. 16 times? I keep growing them back exactly 3 inches too tall. She keeps measuring. It's our little ritual. Eleanor turned off her hose. Now tell me more about this hovering platform. I taught physics for 40 years before retiring. I might have some thoughts. The magnetic field won't be strong enough, Eleanor said, peering over her glasses at my calculations 3 days later. I've accounted for the weight distribution. Not with a car on top, you haven't. She grabbed my pencil, making corrections. You need to increase the repulsive force here and here. How do you know so much about this? I spent 40 years teaching physics, young man, and another 10 fighting with Margaret over my bird feeders. She smiled wickedly. Nothing would please me more than seeing you succeed. With Eleanor's help, the design evolved from probably impossible to technically feasible with enough spite and money. The materials began arriving the following week. Specialized steel components, industrial magnets from overseas, and enough concrete to build a small bunker. The neighbors started to notice. Mr. Mitchell, Margaret's voice carried across 3 lawns as she power-walked toward my driveway. What exactly is happening here? I looked up from where several workers were installing what appeared to be giant metal plates. Home improvement. You haven't submitted any permits or requests for approval. I checked the covenant, I replied smoothly. I don't need approval for non-permanent, non-attached improvements that don't alter the structural integrity of the property. What are those? She pointed at the large metal components. Art installation materials. Section 12 explicitly allows garden art. This doesn't look like garden art. Art is subjective, Margaret. I smiled. I call it suburban freedom. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. We'll see about this. 20 minutes after she left, Officer Reynolds pulled up. He wasn't even trying to hide his amusement anymore. Got another call about suspicious construction activities. Let me guess, Margaret? You know I can't say. He peered at the half-built contraption. Though between us, she used the phrase, potential terrorist facility, which seems a bit much. He squinted. What exactly are you building? A hovering car deck, completely HOA compliant. He stared at me for a long moment. You know, in 15 years on the force, that's a new one. He shook his head. Just keep the noise down after 8, okay? You got it, officer. As Reynolds drove away, Mike approached with our first major problem. We need more power, Mike shouted over the sound of metal groaning. The magnets are at full strength, I yelled back. Then we need bigger magnets. We watched as the platform sagged dangerously to one side during our first test. Or, Eleanor suggested calmly from her lawn chair, sipping iced tea, you could use physics properly instead of brute force. With Eleanor's guidance, we redesigned the system to use cleverly hidden cantilevers and tension supports, creating the optical illusion of hovering while maintaining structural integrity. The magnets were now primarily for stabilization and the impressive hum they produced, rather than bearing the full weight. Word was spreading throughout Sycamore Ridge. Neighbors I'd never spoken to stopped by to check on our progress. Some brought beers. Others offered help. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd run afoul of Margaret's interpretation of the covenant. She made me paint my door 3 times because the shade of blue wasn't exactly coastal mourning from the approved color palette, said Jim from 2 streets over. She measured my grass with a ruler, added Sophia from the cul-de-sac. A ruler? She reported my Christmas lights in February, Thomas chimed in. I was out of town for a month caring for my mother after surgery. My hovering car deck was quickly becoming a symbol of resistance. This meeting of the Sycamore Ridge HOA board has been called to address the situation at 427 Oakwood Drive, Margaret announced to the packed community center. I waved from the back row. Mr. Mitchell is building what he claims is a hovering platform for his automobile, clearly violating the spirit of our covenant. Point of order, called Eleanor, standing. The covenant restricts structures attached to the property. If it's hovering, it's not attached. That's patently ridiculous, Margaret sputtered. Actually, said Howard from the board, adjusting his glasses, she has a point. We never defined structure to include non-attached items. The meeting devolved into chaos as homeowners took sides. I sat back, trying not to look too pleased as years of pent-up HOA frustration exploded into the open. Margaret finally had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. The board will review the covenant language and make a determination, she announced icily. In the meantime, Mr. Mitchell is advised to halt construction. On what grounds? I called out. Safety concerns, she snapped. As if on cue, the next morning brought an official visit. I'm Tom Jenkins, County Building Inspector. The man in the fluorescent vest looked both confused and impressed. I'm here about, well, whatever this is. Hovering car deck, I supplied helpfully. Right. He consulted his clipboard. There's no code for that. Exactly, no code against it either. Fair point, but I still need to ensure it's safe. He walked around the now nearly complete structure. This is either brilliant engineering or a catastrophe waiting to happen. Can't it be both? Tom spent 2 hours examining every inch of our creation. To my surprise, he was actually impressed with the engineering. You've got proper load distribution, secure foundation elements, and the cantilever design is sound, he noted. But I'll need to see calculations for wind resistance, and you'll need a safety rail if this platform exceeds 30 inches at its highest point. These were reasonable requests. I spent the weekend adding the safety features and strengthening the wind bracing. Tom returned, approved the changes, and actually issued a permit. The first official hovering car deck permit in county history, he assured me. Just as things were looking up, disaster struck in the form of an unseasonable windstorm. A section of decorative paneling tore loose and sailed across the street, landing in Agnes Finley's yard, narrowly missing her prized poodle, Snowball. Margaret was at my door before the wind even died down. "Your contraption almost killed Mrs. Finley's poodle." Margaret was practically vibrating with righteous fury. "Snowball is fine," I countered. "And it was a windstorm. Acts of God are specifically excluded from liability in Section 23 of your precious covenant. This has gone far enough. The board is holding an emergency vote to amend the covenant. You can't change the rules just because you don't like how I'm following them. Watch me!" She spun on her heel and marched away. This was escalating faster than I'd anticipated. The next day, I found myself in a downtown law office explaining my situation to Jessica Winters, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. "You're technically right," the lawyer said, looking amused. "The covenant doesn't prohibit what you're doing." "So I can finish building it?" "Legally, yes, but they're already moving to amend the rules." She closed her folder. "You have exactly 3 weeks before their emergency amendment process can be completed." "So I have 3 weeks to finish my hover deck?" "If you want to win this very expensive game of chicken, yes." I called Mike immediately and authorized overtime. With Eleanor coordinating neighborhood volunteers, we worked around the clock. Several neighbors brought food. Others pitched in with labor. Even Officer Reynolds stopped by during his off hours to help with the lighting system. "I'm not taking sides," he insisted, stringing LED lights under the platform's edge. "I just appreciate a good engineering challenge." 2 days before the HOA's emergency amendment meeting, we were ready for our first full test. The platform was secured, the magnetic stabilizers were humming pleasantly, and the optical illusion was perfect. From most angles, my car deck appeared to be floating mysteriously above the ground. "Moment of truth," I said, standing before my gathered neighbors with the keys to my Mustang. Slowly, I drove up the disguised ramp and onto the platform. There was a moment of adjustment as the weight settled and the magnetic stabilizers kicked in. But then, stability. My car sat proudly on what appeared to be thin air, protected from the elements by a sleek canopy that technically wasn't a roof structure, but a temporary weather shield. The crowd erupted in applause. Someone popped champagne. "You did it, you magnificent bastard!" Eleanor said, clinking her glass against mine. "We did it," I corrected. "Team effort." "Mr. Mitchell!" The familiar voice cut through our celebration. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, flanked by 2 other board members. "This is your final warning. Remove this abomination before the amendment meeting, or face the consequences." I raised my glass to her. "Looking forward to the meeting, Margaret." The community center was standing room only. Margaret rapped her gavel. "The board proposes an emergency amendment to Section 8, explicitly prohibiting all forms of hovering, floating, or otherwise unsupported structures, decks, platforms, or car accommodations." "The point of order," called Eleanor again. "Emergency amendments require a 3/4 majority of all homeowners, not just the board." "We're aware," Margaret said coldly. "Then you should also be aware," I stood up, "that I've completed my project as of this morning, grandfathering it in before any amendment." Gasps and scattered applause filled the room. "Additionally," Eleanor added, 17 of us have filed our own proposed amendment to limit the board's ability to issue arbitrary violations." Margaret's face turned an impressive shade of purple. "This is not how things are done in Sycamore Ridge." "Maybe it should be," called Howard, surprisingly. "The board has gotten a bit zealous lately." The vote was taken. Margaret's amendment failed spectacularly, garnering only 12 votes out of the 100+ homeowners present, our counter-amendment passed with flying colors. "This isn't over!" Margaret hissed as she passed me on her way out. "Actually, I think it is," I replied calmly. "But you're welcome to come to the deck warming party tomorrow. 4 o'clock. Open invitation." "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the crowd filling my driveway the next day, "I present the hover deck." With theatrical flourish, I pressed a remote. Lights illuminated the platform, which appeared to float magically above the ground. The assembled neighbors gasped and applauded. Slowly, I drove my Mustang up the disguised ramp and onto the platform, which held firm with only the slightest bounce. "It's beautiful," someone whispered. "It's an abomination," Margaret countered from the street, arms crossed. She'd shown up after all. "It's completely up to code," added Tom, the inspector, raising his beer in salute. I approached Margaret with a glass of punch. "You know, none of this would have happened if you'd just let me build a simple carport." She accepted the punch stiffly. Rules exist for a reason. So do exceptions. I gestured around at the gathered neighbors. Look at what you could have instead of fear and control. Community. Margaret watched as Howard laughed with Eleanor, as children played around the yard, as Officer Reynolds helped Jim from down the street adjust his lawn chair. "It does look rather impressive," she admitted reluctantly. "From an engineering standpoint. High praise indeed." I clinked my glass against hers. "To rule-following, in letter, if not in spirit." She almost smiled. Almost. The aftermath of the Great Hover Deck Rebellion, as it came to be known in Sycamore Ridge, was swift and far-reaching. At the next regular HOA meeting, Margaret was voted out as president, replaced by Howard, who promised a more flexible interpretation of the covenant. My hover deck became something of a local landmark. The county even included it on their quirky architecture tour. I had to install a small sign explaining the engineering principles, as tourists kept asking if it was actually using anti-gravity technology. "You know," Eleanor said, joining me in my driveway a month later where I sat admiring my creation, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I've never seen people so united." "Nothing brings Americans together like spite-based engineering," I replied, handing her a lemonade. "The new HOA president wants to know if you'd consider joining the board." I nearly choked. "Me? On the HOA board?" "Apparently your creative interpretation of regulations could be useful." Down the street, Officer Reynolds drove by slowly, giving us a thumbs up. "I'll think about it," I said, patting the hovering deck that had started it all. "But first, I have some ideas for a floating gazebo." Eleanor laughed. "I was thinking of a levitating bird feeder myself, exactly 3.1 inches above regulation height." Across the street, a real estate agent was showing a young couple a house for sale. I overheard her pointing to my hover deck. "And that's our neighborhood's famous floating car platform. The HOA is very progressive here. They encourage creative solutions." The couple looked impressed. The agent caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. Maybe I would join that HOA board after all. Someone had to ensure the rules remained breakable in exactly the right ways. After all, nothing says American freedom quite like the right to build a ridiculously over-engineered solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. As the sunset cast an orange glow over my hovering car deck, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Not just for the engineering feat or for beating the HOA at their own game, but for accidentally creating something that brought people together. And really, isn't that what neighborhoods should be about? Not uniform mailbox heights and approved shades of beige, but people finding creative ways to coexist, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes through constructive conflict, but always with a sense that we're all in this ridiculous suburban experiment together. I sipped my lemonade and watched as Margaret walked by with her perfectly groomed poodle. She nodded stiffly in my direction, the closest thing to approval I'd ever get. I nodded back, raising my glass slightly. Some feuds never truly end in the suburbs. They just evolve into something more interesting. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and just a little bit spiteful, they float